Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We took a little break last month, but we resume again. And I'm so glad you could find the time to join us if you're in California. I know it's a gorgeous day out there again. So I know you're fighting your better impulse to spend the day outside by joining us instead for this virtual lecture. But I don't think you'll be disappointed. Our speaker today is Professor Winther-Tamaki, who's the chair of art history at the University of California at Irvine. And I was so delighted to learn of his research and work on Kunioshi, because Kunioshi is an artist who we have well represented in our own collection. And I just put on view a major painting. And he so kindly agreed to approach the subject of the Kunioshi still lives in some new work that he's produced, especially for us today. So we feel very fortunate indeed. Let me see, I did ask him for his bio and he sent me a resume that was literally 20 pages in length. So I don't think I'll be able to summarize adequately all of his accomplishments so far, but he's really published extremely deeply in modern and contemporary Japanese art. His last book was called Tsuchi, Earthy Materials in Contemporary Japanese Art, which employs an eco-critical approach to reassess ceramics, photography, and installation art. Very intriguing subject there. And then other books that he's published on 20th century Japanese art include Maximum Embodiment, Yoga, the Western Painting of Japan, and Art in the Encounter of Nations, Japanese and American artists in the early post-war years. His first research on this artist dates to a contribution to the catalog of a major 1989 Kunioshi exhibition in Japan, and he's also published an analysis of the Kunioshi nude. But today, as I said, he's going to focus on the remarkable still life paintings. I should also just mention that there's a lot going on at the museum. If you do happen to be in our area, we're preparing busily for our grand reopening, which is going to take place on August 15th. So after 6 years of renovation, we'll be unveiling our newly renovated galleries, and everything has been completely redone and reinstalled. So I hope you'll take the time to check us out, because we're really a whole brand new place and everybody's very excited. So hope to see you very soon in person. Also, please check our website to see whether or not the subsequent Art Matters lectures are in person or through Zoom. It varies a bit. We are going to in-person format more and more, especially in the fall, but there are a few that are still in this Zoom webinar format. But with that, I'd love to introduce our speaker, Professor Winther-Tamaki. Take it away.
Hello, everybody. I hope that you can see me now. And I would like to share my screen. Let's see. So hopefully it is showing up now. My topic today is Yasuo Kuniyoshi, and I want to thank Ike Kang for this invitation to speak to you today about Yasuo Kuniyoshi, because this is an artist that I have been very interested in for a very long time. And this gave me an opportunity to get out all of my Kunioshi materials that I've assembled for many years. Although you can't see them, they're surrounding me, and have a look at the still life of this artist, the still life painting, which is a topic that I hadn't really focused on in my previous research on him. Thank you also to Alina Kozlovsky for your help setting up this Zoom webinar. So I'd like to start with just a few highlights from what was really a very extraordinary career trajectory on the part of Yasuo Kuniyoshi. He came to North America from his native Okayama in rural Japan in 1906 at the age of 17, with practically no money and no artistic training. no background in the Japanese art world, and he worked on the West Coast in various places in menial jobs, notably picking crops in the fields. And it was only with extraordinary effort that he worked his way into the art world. After arriving in the US, it was after he arrived that he resolved to become an artist, and gradually made his way to New York City, and then for many more years lived in very hard circumstances, worked in more menial jobs as a hotel bellboy and so on. And then finally, his first real break was in 1922 when he was 33 years old, and he was given his first solo exhibition at a New York City art gallery, the Daniel Art Gallery. And then his career, despite the extraordinary anti-Japanese prejudice of American society in this period, and of course the war, when Japanese individuals were greatly disadvantaged by the hostilities and the propaganda, his career as an artist in the the institutions of the American art world were really quite phenomenal. He became a professor at the Art Students League in 1933, and he continued in that position until his death in 1953. And he had the first solo exhibition of a living artist at the Whitney Museum of American Art in 1948, just 3 years after the end of World War II. So part of what we have to consider is why Americans in the art world liked his still life paintings so much. How was he so successful at a time when his identity was such a disadvantage? So now, like I said, I'd like to focus on still life. He was also a painter of nudes, very well known for his nudes, and he painted landscapes, but he was quite well known for his still life paintings, and they were awarded handsomely in these exhibitions. So what is a still life? I think we all know what a still life is. The term derives from a Dutch term from 1650 or so, and really does refer to still things, things that don't move. So if this duck were, I hope you can see my arrow here, if this duck were flying, it would not be a still life. But objects that don't move are what are typically featured in still life paintings, of course, and no human bodies. So this photographic portrait of Kunioshi, there he is, seated with his pipe, is not really a still life. It's kind of a hybrid of the genre of portraiture and still life. This portion of the photograph very much is a still life. One aspect of still life, the still life genre, whether it's photography or painting, is a tension between objects that are symbolic of some larger content or ideology, such as the vanitas paintings with skulls in them, and still life paintings which just show objects from daily life. And that tension is very much alive in Kuniyoshi's work. So here on this table, we'll see this table show up in one of Kuniyoshi's paintings. And there is a deep wooden painted decoy duck and a compat with grapes in it. That object is going to be very importantly symbolic for Kuniyoshi, and it relates to his statement that he had picked grapes as a kind of a sharecropper on the West Coast and even on a farm in Japan before he came to the United States. So that has a autobiographical resonance when it appears in his still life paintings, as it sometimes does. Now, if you can see this quote, this helps us understand a little bit more about his attitude to these objects. This is from a text. He was not a great writer in English, but this text really does tell us something about his thinking regarding still life painting. I don't think very much of meaning of objects when I put them together. Perhaps back in my mind somewhere, I might have some sentimental connections with the color or with the shape, but I never force it consciously toward that end. When it happens, anything, it's always altogether accidental. So there was an intuitive process that he subscribed to, at least in this telling late in his career. But there's another statement I'd like to call attention to. At about this time, when he was already quite successful, even though that's the year of the attack on Pearl Harbor, a student at the Art Students League asked him, "Mr. Kuniyoshi, who do you think is the best painter in America today?" And he said, "Well, if it's still life that you're talking about, me." So he had a lot of confidence as a still life painter. But let's go back. Let's go back to early in his career. This is a painting here on the right that comes right after that first success of his first one-person show at a New York gallery. And it is called Boy Stealing Fruit. Sometimes it's called Boy Stealing Forbidden Fruit. And you can see this too is not strictly speaking a still life, because it has a human figure in it. Still life paintings don't have human figures or narrative, at least that's how it has been defined by some scholars. So the portion of the painting that is a still life is, of course, this bowl of fruit on the table. And the boy has stolen the banana, and it seems to be grabbing for the peach as well. So this table, as you can see, has been lifted up, and that upturned table is an aspect of still life painting that was influentially developed by Cézanne in the late 19th century and scores of other painters since then, and Kunioshi is using that modernist trope. But he's also part of a wave of interest in the early 1920s in American folk art, such as the little still life painting here on the left from about 1840, which similarly depicts a bowl of fruit that also has some flowers in it as well. You can kind of, I think, see that this bowl is rendered in a similar style. So there's a combination of a primitivizing folk art optic here with a modernist idiom that is coming into play. And critics at the time weren't quite sure whether to think of Kunioshi as a naive himself, more like this unknown artist from 1840, or a sophisticated modernist who was willfully, intentionally using modernist forms. Much of the criticism obsesses with Kuniyoshi's foreign identity. There weren't a lot of Japanese people in the United States, in the art world, and so people responded to his art with a kind of hyperbolic language. And this quote from the very influential New York art critic Henry McBride, I think, provides evidence of that. Okay, he didn't come from outer space, he came from Japan. But from McBride's point of view in 1924, he sees things in the civilization we have arranged, much as an arrival from Mars might. Keep in mind that 1924, the year after this painting was done, was the year of the Immigration Act, when U.S. law simply made it illegal for any Japanese person to enter into to obtain citizenship. So it was not possible for Kuniyoshi to become a citizen for the rest of his life, even though he managed to work in the American art world, get married to American a woman, actually twice he was remarried. And so he was very engrossed in American culture, a leading participant with a very extraordinarily high reputation later on, but he was not a citizen. And for many Japanese immigrants like him who were not allowed to become citizens, that was not only insulting, but deeply depressing. In a way, it seemed like their humanity was denied them. So you might think of this boy stealing forbidden fruit as a proxy for the artist himself, that he was reaching into American culture and gathering something from American culture that he wasn't supposed to have. And that something might also have a sexual kind of character. And very soon after this, in the 1920s, surrealism starts to engage with objects such as the banana-like form and the cleft peach in a very conspicuously sexualized, fetishized manner. Kunioshi himself wouldn't go that route, but that was part of the culture of the art world that that was his professional context. So here's another up tilted table. That round table, very much like the table that we saw in the photograph, the portrait that I started with. And now it has just two eggplants. Again, a fruit vegetable that has a kind of sexual connotation to it, in front of a window that's open and shows a landscape with a New England spire. So I'm drawn to a quote from Ichikawa Masanori, who was a museum curator in Japan, and wrote in the catalog of a 2003 retrospective exhibition about the island in Kuniyoshi's work. You can see, obviously, a very strange island on the left here, the island of happiness, where the body of a woman is all spread out and presumably a kind of image of joy that's also slightly naive and folkish and endearing. Well, what Ichikawa was saying in 2003, and at first, when I saw that exhibition back then, it struck me as a very flaky approach, but over time, I'm starting to agree with him. In other words, this still life table has the effect of an island or an oasis or a contained space that this fruit, the eggplants are displayed in, that their aesthetic is kind of presented and created and manipulated in pleasing ways, and it's undisturbed in a way. It's presented for the delectation of the viewer and the artist creator. So Ichikawa spoke very expansively about this metaphor and tried to relate it to various aspects of Kuniyoshi's his social existence in the United States in many works of art. In the late 1920s, Kunioshi travels to Paris, and this experience transforms his style markedly from the sharp edge, kind of brightish colors and very naive style that was his first entree into the American art world, to something that was darker, more muted, earthy tones, and a more frothy kind of brushwork that became his idiom. Less the primitivizing look you see on the right, and more, you might say, more moving in the direction of a kind of naturalism, really looking at furniture, looking at this compote with grapes and pears that are set up in his studio. So you can see now that, and I've listed the awards that he was receiving. He is being greatly appreciated and admired for these kinds of works. This is not really radical art, but it is modernist, and that upturned table is one of the kind of conspicuous markers of the modernist idiom of his that he embraced in these works, and that was so greatly admired. And also it had a kind of French appeal in the New York art world soon after his return from France. Kunioshi was primarily a painter, but he also was a photographer. And at first, his photographer was a way of earning money. He made reproductions of works of art, and later a kind of hobby, but it was an ambiguous art, and he wasn't really sure that it was an art form. It was more some kind of aide de memoire. But this photograph from 5 years after the still life on the left gives you a good sense of one dimension of his still life painting. This painting depicts a lot of wood, the wood surface of the table and the wood floorboards beneath it. And the photograph is obviously a close-up of a barn wall, and these boards are scarred perhaps with some graffiti. The still life painting does not provide that kind of texture. It does not allow you to become close up to the materiality of the wood. Why? Because in this milieu, there was a translation of that which was seen into a kind of brushwork that was very greatly valued as the signature style of this artist. And Kunioshi became known and admired, and his paintings are recognizable even if you can't find a signature, for this kind of frothy look. They add some white and some black, and it almost looks like the wood boards have a white foam, like waves in rapids in a stream. That became kind of typical of his work. And in a way, it was an obstacle between the viewer and the woody materiality of the imagery. So that was a limitation on the degree of realism here. Another interesting aspect of still life paintings in this period was that although the imagery is pretty placid, pears on a table, grapes, although it resonates with that autobiographical story of him once being a picker, a sharecrop picker of grapes in California. Nonetheless, they're just decorative. There's a peach on the table. There's a kind of an interesting vase here. There's an umbrella leaning against the table. There's some bread, a red scarf. But in contrast to that placid kind of imagery, the brushwork and the tones are very stormy. There's a darkness here. The wall almost looks like a cloudy gray, stormy sky. And the other thing that starts to happen is it's not just an upturned table, it might be a chair. So there's a sense of these objects here as rolls on a chair that seem like it's situated in the place of a body. That these are objects, these are inanimate objects, but who does that red scarf belong to? And who's going to eat these rolls? But still, he is using now a vocabulary of objects that are going to repeat. We saw that peach in that early still life. The scarf is going to come back over and over again. It's as though he will not allow himself to use too much red pigment unless he can bring this red scarf into the picture, and that authorizes his selection of red for the painting. Another important aspect of his still life painting is that it is not Orientalizing. He does not have tableware that looks like objects that were from Japan. These objects do not relate to heritage in the sense of his Japanese or Asian kind of identity, despite the fact that people in his environment were constantly viewing him through a filter-like lens that was predicated on his alien Japanese identity. I believe that he resisted that optic that was so pervasive among critics like Henry McBride, who believed he was looking at American art culture like a Martian would. So it's nothing like Stanton McDonald Wright's Dragon Trail, where the still life on a round table has a porcelain vase with a dragon design that is obviously Asian, and in other objects as well. That kind of Orientalism is something that Kunioshi steered clear of very intentionally. He did return only once to Japan for less than 4 months. And in that time, he was lionized by the Japanese art world, who were by artists and others who were aware of his increasing success in the United States. And this is a poster for an exhibition he held in Tokyo while he was there, Bokoku Homon Kinen, as a commemoration of his visit to his mother country. And what does he bring with him from America? But those grapes again on a compote, that same white compote that we've seen now several times. And this scumbled scarf, this one, probably that same red scarf that he would use so often. So this is the still life that is in the Santa Barbara Museum of Art collection. I believe that's being exhibited now. So now that chair and previously table has turned into a type of sofa that is sometimes called the camelback sofa because of its distinctive profile. And what Kunioshi has done is tilted. So that island effect that Ichikawa was using as a kind of metaphor or trope for the understanding of Kuniyoshi's work. That island is very unstable here. It kind of has the impact or the suggestion of a boat that is sinking as it moves downward. And it has an array of objects on it, of course. So right here, you can see a reproduction of a portrait by Goya, the 18th century Spanish artist. So that is on the sofa. And there is, the grapes are there once again. The red scarf is there once again. I think these are eggplants, I'm not sure. Maybe avocados, I don't know. There is an art magazine that is none other than the famous Paris art magazine, the Cahiers d'Art, from Christian Zervos. And there is perhaps most conspicuously and perhaps bizarrely, there is a horse, a galloping horse that seems to be a silhouette. But oddly, there is no rear illumination which would justify a silhouette in this location. And this is said to be an iron weather vane that he collected. So among the various objects that he collected in his studio and used periodically for still lifes was a weather vane. But it is painted on top of this, almost like it is collaged onto the painting. Not only that, but there's another peach again, but this time it's oddly perched or hovering above the rump of the galloping horse. And above that is a upside down mold, plaster mold for a sculpture that he borrowed from his friend. So there are art historical references, autobiographical references, art world, art community references. He's this borrowed from a friend, and this association with American folk art is present once again. I kind of like the interpretation by one scholar, Bruce Weber, who suggested that the upside down molds indicates a foregrounding of naive primitive folk art like the weather vane horse above the high art of the academic casting technique and the Goya. So again, winning prizes, very successful. Again, we have a still life on a sofa where you would expect a body to a human being to be reclining or sitting there. And that sense of a body or the absence of a body is something that is of increasing importance in the still lifes, I think. What happens a few years later in this painting is that a body is suspended or sort of draped across a wicker chair. But this body is a lay figure. That is an artist's mannequin that artists use to work out anatomy and structural relations of the body. But this particular lay figure You can see the joints and perhaps a missing part of the limb or the seam showing. And also it is strewn across the arms of the chair in a way that looks especially uncomfortable and perhaps even sadistic. The way is sort of slouched across there with a kind of maybe a nightgown or some sort of garment. And once again, that red scarf. Here's a photograph by Kuniyoshi where you see that same lay figure, and his friend Morris Cantor, who was the owner of this object, kind of leaning on it casually, smoking his pipe. There is an element of Kuniyoshi's work which I find very disturbing. I do not endorse this aspect of his work. You might consider it from today's point of view of maybe what might be the normative feminist analysis, a kind of misogynistic, aggressive stance toward the female body that seems to be part of what is going on here. Strewn with newspapers. Newspapers are now increasingly going to be part of the repertoire of objects in Kuniyoshi's still lifes, because he is, we can't read the headlines, but we know in the 1930s what is happening as war becomes more and more of a menace, and as fascism is on the rise, and these deeply troubling aspects of life seem to be part of his personal world that he's working out through the female body. So if you look at his paintings of women, not lay figures, but actual women, you can see that that willful treatment of the body as a kind of instrument that can play the music of the artist's own kind of imaginings or yearnings or sexual desires is given free rein. A society that prevented Kuniyoshi from becoming a full citizen, nonetheless, at least in the art world, allocated to him on the basis of his gender, his masculinity, the license to work with the eroticized, sexualized female body in a very poetic way that sometimes has a disturbing quality to it. So now we see that background. It's quite interesting. It's just a wall, right? That's the floor. That's the baseboard. It's just a wall. But Kuniyoshi paints it as though it has meteorological significance, as though it's it reminds me of the brown, sooty skies of California when we have a dreadful fire. That brownish kind of climate that casts these figures in an atmosphere, a kind of tone. In this still life, Kuniyoshi, as you can see, has inverted the table, that probably the same round table that he used in the that appeared in that very first photograph that I showed you. So what is going on here? Well, Kuniyoshi gave us a text about his still life painting where he outlined 6 stages. Number 1, I collect objects. It might be a pebble that I find on a walk. It might be an objet I found in an antique store. Number 2, I live with these things. I let them, in his words, kick around the studio and they become part of life. Number 3, I draw them from different angles and get to know them. Number 4, I arrange these objects in a studio setup. Here is a still life setup photographed by Kunioshi. You can see there's a goblet, a hose, a white pitcher, a maybe a photo lamp or a desk lamp of some kind, some drapery. Some of it is tied onto the pipe that is behind it. And number 5, I paint from that setup. This upside down table and mask is not painted from this particular setup, but you can see it here. And you can now sense that it's painted, but also enlarged. It's much larger than it was likely to have been. And then number 6, I continue painting the setup after I dismantle it. That's an interesting aspect here because in the photograph already, it might be on the other side, but maybe it's already gone. Because Kunioshi says that after I remove the objects, in this case, it was the table, the mask, the newspaper, the tilted blue vase, the rope and tassel, I remove the objects and continue painting and I change it. Maybe he painted out the 3rd leg of this tripod table. And I use my imagination at this point and I reshape it and I endow the still life with feeling. That was his wording. So what happens here? Well, he has flipped the gravity of the classical still life by turning this table upside down. And then somewhat ironically, or maybe even perversely, puts the face on the legs, the upside down legs, suggesting that this is a kind of body that's gone awry. And this object here is a folding ruler. There's a kind of immeasurability. Measure has been broken. And the newspaper calls our attention to more menacing headlines. What is going on? At this point, Kunioshi gives a talk at the Museum of Modern Art as part of a symposium called "Is American Art Menaced by Alien Trends?" And there was a debate at this time about whether people like Kunioshi, who were foreign born and who were from the Asian race, that whether they really could be making American art. And some people were opposed to those who wished to accept Kunioshi and others into the canon of and the practice of American art. And Kunioshi fought back. He spoke very, very strongly here. If anything is a menace to American art, it is those shallow-minded instigators of hatred and cultural provincialism who use the weapon of the press to extol the merits of nationalism. So here is a somewhat tamer still life, not quite inverted, but what I want to point out here, it has an object that comes from Mexico. There is a hint of a narrative. Juanita was inscribed on this particular picture from Mexico that he acquired during a trip there. And there's this bird that's oddly sinking in a way that suggests a failure to fly. But there are also 2 works of Kuniyoshi's own, which are handled here in a way that is quite dismissive, almost vandalizing his own work by the way he bends his picture. This is the photograph that it has been identified, and using another painting similar to this watermelon still life as a kind of tablecloth or placemat underneath the objects. So part of his objects, the repertoire of still life objects involves utilizing these things that are recycling his own previous works of art. This still life now, once again, the table is upended, and now he has added a torn object, a printed matter, a flower. The umbrella appears again, the vase, this time with a crack in it, suspended by a string. The grapes are still here. The red scarf is here again in a magazine image of a woman. This painting was awarded first prize at an exhibition of painting in the US in the middle of the war against Kuniyoshi's homeland. It was singled out among 311 other paintings in that exhibition in Pittsburgh for first prize. It was a rather controversial prize, but I think Shipu Wang, in his important study of Kunioshi from 2011, is spot on when he says that that this award became the best proof of Kuniyoshi's assimilationist stance. The prize supported Kuniyoshi's "This is not a racial tagline." Racial war tagline that sustained his public position during wartime. So it's quite extraordinary that this artist was so successful as a Japanese artist in America during the war, but I think you can kind of see how his ideological, outspoken rhetoric was very sympathetic, at least from the point of view of many Americans, such as the jurors who gave him the first prize in this exhibition. So that was 1944. And the next year, we see a similar still life. So very much like this, he is elevating the grapes. They're still here. They are a leitmotif, a kind of remark that is threaded through many of the still lifes. Now, the primary object, however, is a merry-go-round horse that is lacking a head and is kind of hoisted upward. There is a photograph that shows us that still life setup on a chair. And you can see that now the chair, as well as the table, have been omitted from the painting. And that gives, that in a way that takes this somewhat outside of the still life genre and combines it with the landscape. And it also gives a monumental scale to this horse with other still life objects, especially when you see how small the house is and the birds flying in the sky. So there's a kind of anti-heroic quality to this image because of its monumental stature combined with its headlessness. And also, you might think of it as a kind of crucifixion. There's a crossbar and a vertical piece and a piece of printed matter once again. And that is none other than a poster that Kunioshi himself designed as propaganda for the US Office of War Information in 1943. Here you see it in the still life setup, and here you see it in the painting. It has been grafted into this composition of other objects in a very particular way. First, it is ripped, part of it is missing. Second, a ribbon trails down across it, making it a little bit hard to see. Third, and it is a very violent kind of image that supported the US military effort by describing the horrors, the atrocities of the Japanese military perpetrated against POWs, presumably. But the other thing that happens here in the painting is that the slogan, the text, is invisible. It's behind the horse. In particular, we see a fragment of it which says, "We fight." We can see that much of it. We can kind of guess that word, but omits the remainder of that poster copy. What do we fight for? To build a free world. So there is a very depressing failure of ideological justification for the war effort in the way he has manipulated this this horse. The headlessness seems to symbolize a kind of failure, an existential failure of subjectivity and ideology and initiative. And even though it's so monumental, you might compare this work to a work from a very large painting by a Japanese surrealist painter named Furusawa Iwami called Hungry Ghost from 7 years later, that similarly has a monumental, statuesque, equestrian kind of figure, but this time the bronze statue of a general has been debased and perverted by all kinds of surrealistically rendered horrors that Furusawa experienced as a soldier in the Japanese army in China and as a POW in China for 1 year after the war's end, including an arm grasping the naked body of a prostitute and the amputated leg of this veteran, and the blind eyes and the other woman that is positioned beneath the hindquarters of the horse. Similar kinds of very dystopic, very demoralizing images of the depressing aftermath of the war from very different points of view. And I'd like to end with this work. This is a work from 4 years later. As you can see, Kuniyoshi's style changes quite a bit in the post-war years. The colors become very bright. The forms become very complicated. And that legacy of all of his years and accomplishment as a still life painter migrates into paintings like this, where you're not quite sure what the relationship might be to a still life. Maybe the mask. Maybe that is another one of those lay figures, the puppet-like form that artists draw from, propped up or sort of impaled in a kind of crucifixion manner. But there are 3 figures, 3 bodies are materialized in a still life collage-like kind of fashion. A tormented figure in the background on the left, emerging from a palimpsest kind of a blue sky made of torn paper. And also kind of plastered into that palimpsest, an anatomical diagram of the flayed body, the musculature of a man that has a kind of macabre kind of appearance that really presents revelation, in the word used for the title, in a very disturbing way, suggesting that the deliverance from evil in this revelation is very much an incomplete project with little optimism available for completion. So I would like to stop there, and I think we now have time for discussion or questions.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so let me see whether or not we did get any questions during your lecture. I see that somebody made a interesting comment. This is from Sarah Lands. It just says that the one exception to the still life rule might be a Matisse still life with a goldfish swimming in the bowl on a table, possibly when you were talking at the beginning about the inanimate aspect of still life as a design qualifying property. So that's an interesting comment. You don't seem to have gotten any other specific questions, so maybe I'll pose a few questions to you if you don't mind. This was a really fascinating lecture for me. I'm not very deeply familiar with Kuniyoshi's work, although he has enjoyed certainly large monographic exhibitions in the last decade or so, which is great to see. But I was just wondering, as an Asian American person myself, assimilationist, that's a really difficult word to apply to an artist during this period of time, because it's sort of ambivalent, isn't it? Sort of, it almost as though you're saying, not you personally, that a critic might be pointing out that he's sort of capitulated to a pressure to deny his ethnic identity in order to conform to expectations of what a good American citizen must be. I mean, it's actually a very complicated thing, I'm sure, during this period of time. And I wondered how much critical attention, in terms of identity politics, his art has received in the literature, because he does have this kind of weird, he occupies sort of a weird position just because he was so incredibly successful. And I wondered whether or not you have a critical take on that success, not at face value as just signifying that he was a great artist. I don't know if that is what that means, but it does seem conspicuously strange to me that he should have been awarded quite so many prizes. And I wonder what these jurors were thinking, what they believed he was trying to attempt as his, sort of artistic project. Why was it considered so successful?
Thank you. I think that is really important. That issue is of central importance. So I'm very glad that you have highlight it. I recommend Shipu Wang's monograph on Kunioshi, published in 2011, which I think is a very successful attempt to grapple with precisely that issue. I think that there are certainly many ways in which we can read aspects of cultural heritage into his art. But among the various Kunioshi scholars, my tendency has been to avoid doing that, because it feels like corroborating a racial determinism that is threaded through some of the criticism, such as the quote by Henry McBride that I had at the very beginning. If you recall, Henry McBride, who was a strong supporter and booster of Kunioshi and really wrote very nicely about him many times. Nonetheless, he thought of Kunioshi as being so bizarrely strange, so from so far away a culture, that he might as well be a Martian. And this perspective led people like McBride, in my point of view, to read to read Kuniyoshi's paintings as a manifestation of a kind of innate, involuntary expression of some cultural sensibility that, in the type of metaphor that was current during much of his career, that was running through the blood of the artist, even though he had no, he didn't go to art school in Japan. He wasn't an artist in Japan. He really wasn't familiar with the Japanese art world, except for that one trip, and perhaps from magazines and from visitors in the US, visitors from Japan. Nonetheless, I think there are ways in which there is a rather hermetic, a kind of hermetic aspect of aspects of Japanese kind of cultural attributes that occasionally surface. And there's one painting that the great Edward Hopper's scholar Gail Levin wrote about Kuniyoshi's work, and she made a great deal of that. But I think maybe she overdid it. Maybe she overdid it. In the post-war years, however, there is a greater affirmation. In unfortunately, he died in 1953, so there's a period of the post-war years is only an 8-year period. But in that period, we do hear Kuniyoshi refer to a number of Asian or Japanese artists. We do hear him say that he becomes interested in Zen Buddhism at this time. So in the post-war period, that starts to change. But in the pre-war period and in the war period, I think the environment was rather a difficult one for the overt expression of Japanese cultural identity, and he was cautious in this manner.
Yeah, I mean, and forgive me, it's just it seems kind of astonishing to me still that he could have experienced so much career success. I mean, it just is remarkable to me, and that the still lifes in particular would have been so appealing. And I'm trying to think of the status, School of Paris, the Matisse, Picasso sort of stylization that so many American artists picked up on and then wielded in their own way, Americanized in their own way. But that still, to me, doesn't seem sufficient. These are such extraordinarily peculiar still lives, as you've described. They have a sort of surrealist critical aspect to them. They are definitely unnerving, whether there is a misogynistic aspect to the depictions of the female body. I don't know, I haven't looked enough, I think, at the nudes to put that together. But it just seems still like there has to be some greater significance to his success. It's such a weird thing to say, because usually I'm more interested in artistic failure as usually a signpost of some cultural pressure, some issue of sensitivity in terms of reception that has caused something to be flatly rejected in the art world. It's interesting to me that he could have so much success, and that to me signifies that there is something more going on, beyond him simply being a very gifted artist. And then I wonder too, and I'm sorry, I'm probably talking too much, but it's just a really interesting question to me, is just his critical reception. In the years since he's died, has his work enjoyed more of an interpretive density? I mean, he's had a lot of monographic treatments, it seems, but I just wondered if the interpretation has begun to broaden out to have him placed in the context of other artists, for example, and trying different avenues of interpretation as opposed to just a monographic approach.
Yeah, thank you for those views. Just one more thought about his success. I agree with you that that is a very significant aspect of his career. No other Asian American artist enjoyed that degree of success in his generation. The next in line would be Yamazaki Minoru, the architect, younger and later, and of course Isamu Noguchi, also younger and later. So his success is truly remarkable, and I agree that he should be studied, and it's perplexing in some ways. Maybe part of why that's perplexing is we're part of a culture that honors the avant-garde revolutionary. And when we see an artist getting a lot of prizes and being lionized by the institutions of the art world, maybe it seems like that artist is a sellout or something like that. I don't quite buy into the myth of the avant-garde, so that doesn't bother me nearly as much as it might bother some people. But I do think that there is this social context in which many, not all, he also was controversial, but many presumably liberal art world establishment figures found it very gratifying to be able to heap praise on an artist who seemed to demonstrate that the war fought against the Japanese was not a race war. It was a just war, and it was against fascism. And Kunioshi provided evidence that open-minded Americans were willing to grant the sort of legitimize the talent that he had. But to move on to the your other question, equally important, of his posthumous reputation. Before he died, as he started moving into the style represented by the painting on the right, Revelation, he was kind of marginalized from his previous position at that almost pinnacle of American art by abstract expressionism, and it very quickly started to look like old-fashioned figurative art. And I think that bothered him in the years before he died. And that led to a decline in his reputation that was prolonged. And it wasn't, I suppose it wasn't until the 1980s. And I guess I was part of this. I was working for a Japanese corporation, and that was a period when Japanese corporations had a lot of extra capital, and they purchased a lot of Kunioshi paintings, and many of his best works are now in Japan. So that maybe was the first important revision. There are also scholars that in the US who are very attentive to Kunioshi, Tom Wolfe, Alexandra Monroe, Susan Lubowski. These people started writing about his work in the 80s and the 90s. Bruce Weber looked at the photography, others. And then once again, I would point to Shipu Wang's monograph, which I think is very useful in bringing Asian American studies, cultural studies, post-colonial studies kinds of approaches to the reassessment of Kuniyoshi's very unique position in American art.
Well, thank you so much for that. I think we might have used up all of our time for questions. I'm sorry that I hogged all of your time, but it's just, he's a fascinating artist to me. And it is sort of ironic that he should be embraced as a leading Japanese American modernist when he was actually never granted citizenship. In fact, it's a funny question if you work in a museum, whether or not you should categorize him as American or not. I think typically he is put into that category, even though technically he wasn't American, just because of the resistance of the culture at that moment. So anyway, it's just wonderful for this artist to receive more attention. And I'm so pleased that you were able to join us. And I do hope you'll come back again and speak to us more. I have all sorts of questions for you that we'll probably pursue in a later conversation today. But I do hope that all of you will take some time to read up on Kunioshi, because he really does deserve the attention, and really a truly fascinating artist. But thank you so much again for joining us, and I hope you'll come back and see us again for the next lecture, which is on a completely different subject. It's the restoration of the Ghent Altarpiece. We'll be enjoying the wonderful images that the lead conservator on that project can provide. That's Bart de Volder, who's coming to us from Princeton University. But anyway, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Professor. We'll be talking soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.